30 Royal Men. 30 Stories the Crown Never Wanted Told. Behind the palaces, portraits, and polite titles lies a secret lineage, one woven not through heirs and wars, but through forbidden letters, vanished companions, and affections history tried to rewrite. These aren't tabloid rumors, they're ghosted footnotes. Welcome to a hidden side of royalty, where power wore perfume and love left no heirs. This is 30 Secret Gay British Royals, and once you see the pattern, you'll never look at the crown the same way again. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. It helps keep these untold stories alive. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who's out there uncovering secrets with us. 1. King James VI and I. For someone who united two crowns, James VI of Scotland and I of England spent an awful lot of time tangled in affairs that had very little to do with governance, unless you count the governing of hearts, which, to be fair, he tried very hard to do. In the early 17th century, the mere suggestion of a monarch harboring romantic affections for another man should have been political dynamite. But James didn't merely weather the rumors. He invited them in, poured them a drink, and whispered endearments in Latin. His favorites weren't discreet little flings tucked behind the velvet curtains of court. They were young men given titles, land, and proximity, not just to the throne, but to the king's bedchamber, his correspondence, and sometimes his thoughts, which, judging by the tone of his letters, could be dangerously lovesick. Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset, was the first great love of his reign. James met him at a jousting match. Carr fell from his horse and into the king's favor in the most literal sense. James taught him to read, elevated him socially, and gifted him a power he barely knew how to wield. The result? A political scandal so convoluted it eventually involved murder, imprisonment, and, naturally, a woman blamed for it all. James stood by Carr longer than was politically wise because politics were never really the point. But it was George Villiers, the infamous Duke of Buckingham, who became the defining relationship of James's later life. Young, handsome, and skilled in the art of courtly seduction, Villiers swept into James's world like a well-placed sonnet. The king called him "my sweet child and wife." He signed letters with lines like, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." And while official records tried their best to categorize the relationship as chivalric, platonic, or perhaps just whimsically affectionate, nobody really believed that. Least of all Parliament, which grew increasingly uncomfortable watching a monarch lose himself in poetry and patronage. James was undeterred. He arranged lavish positions for Villiers and ignored the mounting resentment from nobles who saw the favoritism as dangerous, even treasonous. What made it more scandalous wasn't just the emotional intimacy, but the visibility. James wasn't hiding this. He traveled with Villiers, touched him in public, defended him in council. They shared living quarters. The optics weren't subtle, and that was the point. Modern historians have done backflips trying to decode the exact nature of these relationships. Were they sexual? Romantic? Deep emotional bonds expressed in the florid style of their time? The truth, of course, is elusive, but in James's case, elusiveness looks suspiciously like defiance. This was a man raised in a brutal, paranoid Scottish court who still decided to write love letters to another man on royal letterhead. Even in death, the mystery lingers. James ordered that Villiers be buried near him. "They will lie together in the dust," one courtier remarked, "as they did in life." Maybe that's poetic flourish. Maybe it's a moral indictment. Maybe it's just British history doing what it does best, burying its secrets 6 feet deep and pretending not to remember the map. But there's no forgetting that James's reign wasn't just the beginning of the United Kingdom. It was also the beginning of a long, uncomfortable tradition. Powerful men loving other men in ways their world refused to name. And yet, James did name it, over and over again, with titles, letters, and far too many sonnets. Which brings us inevitably to the king who followed a similar path, but with bloodier consequences. His name was Edward, and he loved a man named Piers. 2. Edward II of England. If King James wrote sonnets for his lovers, Edward II left behind a different kind of poetry, whispered rumors, bitter chronicles, and the slow, dramatic collapse of a monarchy under the weight of one very inconvenient love. Where James embraced affection with velvet and verse, Edward clung to it with the stubborn recklessness of a man who mistook feeling for power. He was never supposed to be a great king. Even in his youth, Edward was more interested in music, rowing, and the company of handsome young men than in the endless, joyless business of governance. But no one expected that his fondness for one man, Piers Gaveston, would become the scandal of an era. Gaveston was not noble-born, but he was beautiful, ambitious, and disturbingly confident for a man so recently elevated. Edward made him Earl of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for members of the royal family, and showered him with jewels, lands, and privileges that alarmed the nobility. It was, they said, beyond natural affection. And that was being polite. The barons hated him. The clergy were appalled. The Queen, Isabella of France, no political innocent herself, found herself pushed to the sidelines of a marriage that existed mostly for the production of heirs and the avoidance of gossip. Unfortunately, neither task was completed with much efficiency. Gaveston's presence at court was relentless. He dressed like royalty, walked with the king's arm around him, and laughed too loudly at jokes that seemed more inside than diplomatic. And Edward, unbothered, unfiltered, ignored every warning, every threat. The nobles exiled Gaveston, twice, and Edward brought him back, twice. When they forced Gaveston out of the kingdom, Edward wrote public letters calling him his brother, his other self, his faithful companion. When Gaveston returned, it was with pomp, parties, and an entourage so extravagant, it made the coronation look understated. The nobles didn't just see favoritism. They saw a threat to the very architecture of power. A love so visible it began to warp the monarchy around it. Eventually, it ended as all dangerous royal affections do, with betrayal, blood, and something quietly rewritten in the official records. Gaveston was captured and executed by a group of barons who claimed to be protecting the realm. Edward was devastated, and his revenge was slow and brutal, even if the chronicles preferred to call it strategic repositioning. But Edward didn't learn. He replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man equally ambitious and equally disliked, though less flamboyant and far more ruthless. The dynamic was eerily similar. Despenser was elevated beyond reason, granted lands that didn't belong to him, and indulged in ways that raised more than eyebrows. And again, the court murmured. The nobility plotted. The queen waited. Isabella eventually launched a rebellion with her lover, a French nobleman, because symmetry matters, and overthrew her husband. Edward was imprisoned, humiliated, and stripped of his crown. Officially, it was for misrule. Quietly, it was for the unspoken thing that had shaped his entire reign, a love the kingdom could not absorb. To this day, historians debate how real it all was, but the letters remain. The gifts, the titles, the dangerous elevation of private emotion into public policy. Edward II didn't just fall in love, he rearranged a monarchy around it. And England rearranged itself in response. And yet, for all his visible transgressions, Edward still had the shield of medieval myth. Centuries later, the same behavior, the same desire, would reappear in a far more modern royal. A man born into the 20th century, a brother to a king, a duke who flew planes, wore tailored uniforms, and haunted the rumors of palace walls just as intensely. If you've made it this far down the royal rabbit hole, don't forget to subscribe. There's a whole lot more where this came from. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you unraveling history over breakfast, or wide awake at 2 a.m. like the rest of us? 3. Prince George, Duke of Kent, Some men are born into silence. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was born into jazz. He was the fourth son of King George V, a man so emotionally repressed that he once criticized his own children for walking too loudly. George, by contrast, walked like a man chasing the sound of his own legend, a royal in name, but in appetite, utterly ungovernable. His life reads like a script that never quite made it to screen. Pilot, poet, naval officer, drug experimenter, rumored bisexual, tabloid mystery, and tragic icon. And somewhere in the fog of scandal and service, a question still echoes. Who was he really? What we do know is this: he moved in rarefied air. Unlike his more buttoned-up brothers, George had charm, dangerously so. He was the royal most often seen at soirees, art salons, backstage dressing rooms. He read Proust. He played the saxophone. He partied with Greta Garbo. He drank champagne like water, and once allegedly swam naked in the fountains at Versailles. But behind the silk cravats and wide-lapelled uniforms, the rumors pressed in. His name was quietly linked to men, artistic, sharp-witted, beautifully disreputable men. Most famously, Noel Coward, the playwright who once described the prince as unlike any other royal, beautifully absurd. Their friendship was unusually intense, even by the slippery standards of aristocratic camaraderie. Private letters between them were destroyed after George's death, not by accident, but with urgency, the kind that suggests more than theatrical banter. Another name that floats through the smoke is Anthony Blunt, later unmasked as a Soviet spy and one of the so-called Cambridge Five. Blunt was intelligent, dangerous, and fond of collecting secrets. The nature of his connection to George is undocumented. That, of course, has never stopped speculation. In some versions, George is a willing participant. In others, he's a victim of manipulation. But in all of them, the line between public duty and private life is blurred beyond recognition. The royal family naturally denies all of it. Official biographies paint George as a charismatic but troubled figure, dashing, if a bit indulgent. His marriage to Princess Marina of Greece was elegant and photogenic. He fathered 3 children. He performed royal duties. He wore the right uniforms at the right times. But it was never enough to erase the scent of scandal that followed him like cologne. When he died in a mysterious plane crash in 1942, it was during active service with the Royal Air Force. The official report was vague, the passengers list was incomplete, and the conspiracy theories, as always, filled in the gaps. Was it sabotage? A mission gone wrong? Or simply fate catching up with a man who refused to stay within royal lines? Even his grave, tucked away in Frogmore, feels too quiet for someone who danced so loudly through the shadows of his time. And yet, George was not the only royal man whose intimate preferences drew whispers behind palace doors. Just a few years earlier, another figure was already navigating similar terrain, this time with the added complication of war, empire, and files locked deep in MI5 archives. 4. Lord Mountbatten. In the polite language of royal obituaries, Lord Louis Mountbatten was a man of duty, service, and distinction. A naval hero, the last Viceroy of India, mentor to Prince Charles, uncle to Prince Philip, architect of weddings, funerals, and royal image management. But beneath the crisp white uniforms and that cultivated imperial dignity, Mountbatten was also a man wrapped in whispers, his legacy threaded with the kind of rumors that never made it into the official biographies, but somehow refused to die. He was known to MI5. That much we know. Declassified files hint at something unorthodox in his private life, specifically his preference for young men. The phrasing is deliberately vague, the tone clinical. But the file existed. It followed him through decades of royal service, a quiet shadow in a life staged entirely in the limelight. Mountbatten married Edwina Ashley, a match that was socially strategic and emotionally mismatched. Their relationship was famously open, a fact both tolerated and documented. Edwina had lovers across continents. Louis, it's believed, had his own discretions. But while her affairs made it into the gossip columns, his remained tucked inside intelligence reports and murmured warnings. His friendships with young male assistants, aides, and military cadets were noted as unusually close. Hotel arrangements, travel companions, gifts, patterns. Never quite scandal, but always close enough to matter. Of course, the official narrative insists that Mountbatten was merely generous, fatherly, loyal. He loved mentoring young people, they say, especially young men, especially handsome, ambitious, eager young men in uniform. Many who knew him described him as magnetic. Others, particularly within intelligence circles, were less generous. One post-war assessment simply described him as compromised. Another warned that his private life might pose a security risk. Still, nothing ever broke into the open. The press, deferential as ever, never printed the allegations. The palace never addressed them. And Mountbatten, always one step ahead, continued to position himself as the elder statesman of the monarchy, the man who taught Charles how to walk, talk, salute, and feel things very quietly. Their correspondence was intimate. Some of Charles's most emotionally revealing letters as a young man were written to Mountbatten. Whether the connection was paternal, controlling, or something harder to define, it clearly left an impression. When Mountbatten was assassinated by the IRA in 1979, the news was delivered with solemn shock. A statesman lost, a symbol shattered. But as always, the official story was incomplete. The private man, the one whose name danced at the edges of so many unspoken conversations, was buried alongside his secrets. And perhaps fittingly, one of those secrets still echoes, through the generation he mentored. Because the next royal in our story grew up under Mountbatten's watchful eye. A future king shaped by a man who never fully explained himself. A prince who, in his youth, found himself surrounded by elegant, intelligent men, some of whom understood him far better than his own family ever could. 5. Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor. It's ironic that the man who gave up the British throne for love is still most famous for loving the wrong woman. But what history prefers not to ask, at least not too loudly, is whether Wallis Simpson was the full story, or if Edward VIII, later styled the Duke of Windsor, spent a life dodging a far more delicate truth, that his affections may not have been quite as straightforward as royal biographers would like you to believe. To be clear, Edward was no stranger to scandal. He made headlines for dating American divorcees, dancing in Paris nightclubs, and publicly despising the very institution he was born to lead. But buried beneath the glamour and rebellion was a quieter, more persistent rumor. That the king, long before he fell for Wallis, had built a social life around the kind of company that made the palace distinctly nervous. Artistic, theatrical, cosmopolitan men who didn't bother pretending to be straight. Throughout his youth, Edward surrounded himself with a dazzling circle of aesthetes, fashion designers, decorators, actors, and European courtiers who moved fluidly through gender and desire. Some of them, like Cecil Beaton, were openly gay. Others, like the famously discreet Noel Coward, operated in coded winks and silences. Edward's friendships with these men weren't just casual acquaintances. They were deep, frequent, emotionally intense, and curiously well documented in society pages that never quite said what everyone else was thinking. His sense of style became legendary. He was obsessive about tailoring, fragrances, interior design, and aesthetic control, not just for himself, but for the spaces he inhabited and the people around him. It wasn't just dandyism. It was curation. And many of those he curated were men with taste, men with secrets, and men who whispered that Edward's sexuality was not nearly as narrow as royal portraiture implied. One persistent rumor, rarely addressed and never confirmed, links him to his personal valets, men who traveled with him, dressed him, lived in his proximity for years, and left no public record beyond a few suspiciously generous bequests and wills. In private letters, Edward referred to some of these men with language that read less like employer to staff and more like something hovering in the emotionally charged space between affection and dependence. Then there's Wallis herself, who, in the great tradition of covering for powerful men, may have functioned less as a romantic partner and more as a protective screen. Some contemporaries whispered that she wasn't Edward's weakness, but his shield. She played the role of seductress, but many believe she was also his most loyal co-conspirator, someone who understood what needed hiding and how to hide it with elegance and flair. Edward's post-abdication years were spent in glamorous exile, a self-imposed twilight that looked like freedom but often felt like containment. In Paris, he held court among the wealthy and the fallen, attended the openings of art galleries funded by old lovers of his old friends, and remained a man strangely disconnected from everything except performance. The official line is that he gave up everything for love. But what if it was the other way around? What if he gave up the throne because he knew, or feared, that staying would require giving up something far more essential, the ability to love in ways that didn't fit the crown? And if Edward walked away to protect that truth, the next man didn't have the luxury of exile. He ruled, and he ruled with whispers in his wake, rumors of handsome Dutch favorites and moonlit meetings in gardens not meant for politics. 6. King William III. History likes its kings to be decisive, pious, and preferably heterosexual. William III, better known as William of Orange, the Protestant hero who overthrew his Catholic father-in-law and installed constitutional monarchy in Britain, ticked most of those boxes. But behind the powdered wigs and Protestant victories was a quieter, stranger truth. William had favorites, and not just political ones. His reign, shared with his wife Mary II, is remembered for religious reform and a distinctly cold marital relationship. Mary was devout, dutiful, and often lonely. William was cold, blunt, and, by several accounts, emotionally absent. The official story blames politics and pressure. The unofficial one starts to shift when you look closely at the men who orbited William's life with unusual intimacy, and the titles, favors, and proximity they were granted in return. Two names in particular continue to disturb the calm surface of William's reputation: Hans Willem Bentinck and Arnold Joost van Keppel. Dutch noblemen, military men, handsome, devoted, and crucially, very, very close to the king. Bentinck was with William from the beginning, a companion during his earliest military campaigns and his most private moments. He wasn't just a general or an advisor, he was something more. William entrusted him with his health, his travel, his letters. When William fell ill with smallpox, it was Bentinck who sat beside him, risking infection. William later gave him titles, land, and access that astonished and annoyed the English nobility. Bentinck was, by all appearances, indispensable. But it was Van Keppel who drew the sharpest scrutiny. Much younger, charming, and more flamboyant, Van Keppel arrived at court like a flash of scandal waiting to happen. William elevated him rapidly, far more rapidly than protocol allowed. Within a year, Van Keppel was master of the robes, groom of the bedchamber, and a newly minted earl. He traveled with the king, dined with him, and, most provocatively, shared his private chambers on several documented occasions. It wasn't just that William liked these men, it was how much he needed them. Letters from the time refer to Van Keppel as the king's delight and the person on whom all smiles fall. Parliament was less charmed. Rumors of unnatural affections spread like ink on parchment. Political cartoons began to depict William in compromising poses with his bedchamber favorites. Even some clergymen, otherwise grateful for his Protestant reign, murmured concern about sodomite influences at court. Always carefully coded, of course. To this day, historians debate whether the relationships were physical, emotional, or merely exaggerated by rivals. But William's own behavior suggests that these were not ordinary friendships. When Bentinck tried to challenge Van Keppel's influence, William reportedly turned icy and defensive. He protected Van Keppel to the very end, even sending him to negotiate sensitive treaties on his behalf, a move that baffled seasoned diplomats and infuriated his ministers. When William died in 1702, unmarried and childless, Van Keppel was left with lands, titles, and a reputation that never quite cleared. The palace quietly distanced itself. Portraits were removed. Papers went missing. And yet the echoes remain. In the oddly intimate letters, the rapid promotions, and the way William's most enduring attachments were always male, always younger, and always just a little too close. And in this tradition of troublesome brothers and two beautiful favorites, the next royal comes crashing into history with wine, rebellion, and betrayal. His death was infamous. His affections, whispered through time. 7. Prince George, Duke of Clarence. He was the handsome one. That's how people remembered George, Duke of Clarence. Brother to Edward IV and Richard III, the doomed middle sibling in a dynasty built on betrayal. In Shakespeare's version, he drowns in a barrel of wine. In real life, he drowns in something far harder to define: court intrigue, family politics, and the kind of whispered rumors that always seem to cling to men who get too close to other men. George's story has all the makings of a Plantagenet tragedy. Born royal, trusted briefly, betrayed deeply. He was ambitious, arrogant, and just naive enough to believe that charm could substitute for loyalty. But somewhere behind the power grabs and attempted coups, there was another narrative, quieter, murkier, that followed him from the corridors of Warwick Castle to the Tower of London. It started, as these stories often do, with friendships that became conspicuous. George was rarely alone. His circle of male companions was tight, loyal, and unusually intimate. Courtiers noticed. Chroniclers hinted. There were no direct accusations. This was the 15th century, after all. But the language used to describe Clarence's household began to shift. Men devoted to him. Favorites never far from his side. Relationships closer than custom allowed. In a time when most royal men were defined by military alliances and marriage contracts, Clarence seemed more emotionally invested in his private retinue than his public responsibilities. One name stands out: a young knight in Clarence's household whose rapid rise was as dazzling as it was suspicious. His position depended entirely on Clarence's patronage. When questioned, Clarence defended him fiercely, even recklessly. That loyalty would cost him, not just politically, but personally. For those observing, it looked like more than favoritism. It looked like dependence. And dependence was dangerous, especially when the crown was in play. George tried, disastrously, to seize power from his brother Edward IV. He made alliances with enemies, spread rumors about the Queen, and dabbled in conspiracies he barely understood. When he was finally arrested, the charges were as much about insubordination as they were about impropriety. Testimonies mentioned unmanly influence in his court. Letters vanished. Servants disappeared. But the implication was clear. Clarence's judgment was compromised, and not just by ambition. Edward IV signed the death warrant himself. The story goes that Clarence chose to be executed by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. It's a dramatic detail, maybe too dramatic to be true, but fitting. A man killed by the very indulgences that defined him. Publicly, it was a punishment for treason. Privately, it felt like a cover story for a royal family desperate to erase a scandal they couldn't name. George's death became legend, but the nature of his affections, like so many of his generation, was quietly erased, scrubbed from chronicles, smoothed into euphemism, left to rot in the tower, along with everything else inconvenient about his legacy. And yet, centuries later, the pattern repeats. Another prince, another scandal, another set of destroyed letters, and a sister-in-law determined to burn the truth before history got its hands on it. 8. Prince Francis of Teck. If Prince George, Duke of Clarence, was undone by loyalty to the wrong people, then Prince Francis of Teck was undone by the people who were loyal to him. Until they weren't. He wasn't a major figure in royal politics. He never reigned. He never led an army. He never made history in the traditional sense. But what Francis lacked in public importance, he more than made up for in private disruption. Because sometimes the most dangerous royals aren't the ones who rule. They're the ones who know too much and live too freely. Francis, or Frank as he was known among friends, was the younger brother of Queen Mary, wife of George V and grandmother to Queen Elizabeth II. A minor royal with major connections, Frank moved through aristocratic society with the easy charm of a man who had no real responsibilities and too much time. He was handsome, notoriously flirtatious, and beloved by women, and quietly by men. The stories begin with gossip, as they always do. There were parties, private retreats, and lavish weekends in country houses where guest lists were curated not by social rank, but by personal preference. Frank's circle included artists, poets, actors, and a notable number of unmarried noblemen with reputations for being eccentric. He was known to disappear for days at a time with one or two male companions, returning to London refreshed, unspecific, and always dressed impeccably. He never married. He fathered no children. And his most enduring legacy might not be his life, but what happened to his letters after his death. In 1910, Francis died suddenly at the age of 40. His passing wasn't suspicious, but what followed certainly was. Queen Mary, who rarely made personal decisions with emotional motivation, reportedly ordered a complete purge of his private papers. Letters were destroyed. Diaries vanished. Even his will, it was said, was rewritten under pressure. All done swiftly, quietly, and with the full backing of the palace. Why? That's the question historians continue to circle. Some believe there were love letters, to men, among his effects. Others suggest he had been blackmailed. A few think he may have been involved in discreet affairs with individuals who could not afford exposure. Whatever the case, the reaction was immediate and surgical. Queen Mary, who maintained a cold and immaculate public image, treated her brother's memory like a security breach. Which raises a deeper question. What was she protecting? Her brother's dignity, or the monarchy's? Francis's name rarely appears in official histories. He's a footnote, a family shadow. But among those who study the coded language of royal life, he remains one of the most compelling blanks on the map. A man loved by many, claimed by none, and scrubbed from the record with suspicious efficiency. And yet some legacies can't be destroyed. Just ask his nephew, a young man born to inherit everything, and who found himself drowning in rumors of his own, in a case so infamous it linked him to scandal. Scandal to silence, and silence to a brothel few dared to speak of out loud. 9. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Prince Albert Victor was born to be king, and died before he could become anything else. History remembers him as a handsome, sickly young man, forever frozen in portraits with a soft jawline, tired eyes, and an expression that seemed to ask for a quieter life than the one he was given. The eldest son of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, and the grandson of Queen Victoria, Albert Victor was heir to the British Empire at its most inflated moment. But beneath the carefully brushed hair and royal insignia, he carried the full weight of a family legacy, and possibly a secret that never stopped haunting him. The rumors began while he was still in uniform. As a young man, Albert Victor served with the British Army in India and later studied at Cambridge, but neither military nor academic life suited him. Friends described him as dreamy, distracted, and emotionally fragile. He formed close, sometimes intense friendships with other young men, and these relationships were often noted, but never explained. Then came 1889. That year, London was rocked by the Cleveland Street scandal, an explosive investigation into a male brothel in the heart of the West End. It was frequented by members of the aristocracy, civil servants, and reportedly, men from the royal circle. When the story broke, it threatened to destabilize the entire establishment. Names were redacted, trials were hushed, and key witnesses were quietly sent abroad. But one name kept resurfacing in the background noise: Prince Albert Victor. No official documents confirmed his involvement. No charges were ever filed. And yet the palace's reaction was immediate and unusually aggressive. Editors were warned, papers were seized, testimonies vanished. The Attorney General was pressured into limiting prosecution. In public, Albert Victor remained untouchable. In private, his reputation had already curdled. Supporters claimed he was merely naive, that he was being dragged into guilt by association. Critics weren't so generous. They pointed to his aimless behavior, his nervous disposition, and the striking number of destroyed letters following the scandal. Some whispered he had been blackmailed. Others said he had been protected. Queen Victoria, already wary of her grandson's health and temperament, became more protective than ever. She pushed for a politically convenient engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, the same Mary who would later marry his brother George and become queen. But the wedding never happened. Albert Victor died in 1892, at age 28, officially of influenza complicated by pneumonia. It was sudden, tragic, suspicious, if you looked at it sideways, but not in a way that could be proven. His funeral was grand, public, and strangely hollow. The man who would have been king was buried without fanfare for his character, only for his title. To this day, historians remain split. Was Albert Victor the victim of innuendo, or its proof? Was he a confused young man caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time, or someone whose affections didn't match his dynasty's expectations? Either way, the silence around his story speaks volumes. And yet, silence was a recurring theme for his family. Because as the next royal would prove, even those who fought for the crown on the battlefield were not immune to the quiet, suffocating grip of secrecy, or the strange, powerful friendships forged under fire. 10. Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Prince Rupert of the Rhine is often remembered for his swashbuckling exploits. The cavalry charges, the long flowing hair, the reckless courage on Civil War battlefields. He was a dashing figure, painted with dramatic lighting and romantic idealism, the very image of a royal soldier. But behind the portraits and the musketeer legend was a man far harder to categorize. War hero, pirate, alchemist, artist, loyal nephew to King Charles I, and, some say, deeply emotionally entangled with the men he fought beside. Rupert was born into chaos and never quite escaped it. Exiled from the Palatinate as a child, he arrived in England already marked by loss. His uncle, Charles I, saw in him a symbol of royal resistance and elevated him to the head of royalist cavalry during the English Civil War. Rupert proved brilliant in battle, and increasingly difficult off the field. He surrounded himself with a loyal cadre of officers, men who admired him, followed him into reckless engagements, and remained strangely close in both life and death. Among these was a group of fellow royalist soldiers, with whom Rupert shared not only tents and campaigns, but years of close correspondence, private travel, and an intimacy that raised eyebrows even among hardened warriors. Letters between Rupert and certain officers survive in fragmentary form, filled with poetic flattery, declarations of affection, and the kind of emotionally saturated language that goes far beyond typical 17th century camaraderie. One such officer, whose name appears repeatedly in Rupert's letters, was described by contemporaries as his constant companion, inseparable from the prince, and beloved above all. When this officer was wounded, Rupert reportedly refused to leave his side, even under fire. When he died, Rupert entered a period of deep mourning, withdrawing from his men and reportedly refusing food for days. To some, it was noble grief. To others, it hinted at something more complex, an affection that didn't quite match the battlefield mold. Still, Rupert's legend remained fiercely heterosexual in public. After the war, he became involved in overseas trade, pirate hunting, and scientific experimentation, always a man in motion. He never married, but had an acknowledged mistress and an illegitimate daughter, as if to underline his virility in ink. And yet, the nature of his most intimate connections, the ones forged not in court but in blood-soaked camps, remain impossible to untangle. Part of the complication lies in the man himself. Rupert was fiercely private, but not especially guarded. He was known for emotional intensity, for forging rapid and overwhelming attachments, and for speaking in terms that often sounded more like devotion than mere friendship. In court, some found him arrogant. In the field, his men found him magnetic. And in the private papers of rival commanders, Rupert's name was sometimes paired with language more commonly used to describe lovers than comrades. In the end, Rupert died not on the battlefield, but in his study, an inventor, a royal outlier, and a man whose public image never quite matched the intensity of the lives he touched. His legacy was sanitized, of course, turned into a romantic war hero, conveniently heterosexual, conveniently simple. But the patterns were already forming. Patterns of men whose lives, though surrounded by crowns and cannon fire, seemed always to return to the company of other men. And the next royal in this silent lineage would spend his life cloaked in uniforms, letters, and formal distance, revealing just enough to raise questions, and never quite enough to answer them. 11. Henry, Duke of Gloucester. In the family portraits, he's the one who rarely smiles. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, third son of King George V, younger brother to Edward VIII and George VI, was the quiet royal, dutiful, measured, seldom in the spotlight except when protocol demanded it. He lacked his brother's charisma, or perhaps he simply refused to perform it. Where Edward flirted with infamy and George stumbled into a reluctant kingship, Henry kept to the margins. But as always with these stories, the silence around him wasn't emptiness. It was a signal. A man who hides nothing has nothing to lose. But Henry hid a great deal, and not especially well. On paper, his life reads like a dry procedural. Military education, ceremonial appearances, brief stints as governor-general, endless royal tours. But peel back the public schedule, and patterns begin to form. During his military postings in Africa and the Middle East, Henry was rarely alone. He cultivated intense, long-lasting attachments to his male aides. Men who followed him from assignment to assignment, shared his quarters, and acted not merely as assistants, but as confidants, companions, and emotional ballast. One such aide appears in several surviving letters described by Henry with an emotional frankness rarely seen in royal correspondence of the era. He wrote of feeling lost without him, of needing his presence to steady the day, and of a kind of companionship that blurred the line between brotherhood and dependency. No language is explicitly romantic, but neither is it safely platonic. It reads like the diary of a man who did not have the words, or perhaps the permission, to name what he felt. What's more revealing is the response from those around him. Courtiers remarked on his unusual attachments. Military colleagues described his emotional responses to particular subordinates as excessive. And royal biographers, decades later, skipped entire chapters of his life with phrases like, "Little is known of his time abroad," which is royal code for "there's too much we can't say." It didn't help that Henry married late and reluctantly. At 41, he wed Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott, a respected aristocrat with a keen sense of privacy and an apparent willingness to look the other way. Theirs was a partnership of mutual convenience, calm, distant, and sparsely affectionate in public. Their children were raised dutifully. Their correspondence was formal. And yet, Henry's private calendar continued to include extended visits with old male friends, many of whom had served with him during the war and continued to move in his circle long after. Unlike his brother Edward, Henry never danced in scandal. But perhaps that was the result of calculated restraint. The palace knew how to manage an open secret, especially one as quiet as Henry. No headlines, no trials, just a slow, quiet withdrawal from public view and a series of carefully archived letters that almost, but never quite, said the thing everyone already suspected. When he died in 1974, he was buried with the honors due a royal duke, but not with the emotional gravity of a man deeply understood. He remains, to this day, one of the least remembered sons of George V. And yet his life, or at least the shape of its absences, continues the pattern of royal men who were never quite allowed to name what they loved. And from those wartime friendships to the glittering salons of Edwardian London, the pattern only deepens. Because the next name on this silent list belongs to a noble descendant who glided through a world where secrets wore tuxedos, and every whispered confession came wrapped in champagne and coated glances. 12. Lord Louis Francis Greville. Most people have never heard of Lord Louis Francis Greville, and that in itself is telling. As a descendant of the Plantagenets through the Earl of Warwick's line, his bloodline was royal, but his role was decorative. One of those glittering, unofficial satellites who orbited just outside the core of the monarchy, close enough to attend the parties, far enough to vanish when things became complicated. And they did become complicated, because Louis Greville belonged to a particular kind of Edwardian elite, aristocratic, elegant, and quietly entangled in the hidden emotional economies of other men. Born into nobility but not destiny, Greville moved through the upper tiers of British society with the practiced grace of someone who knew the rules and how to elegantly sidestep them. He was educated, charming, and unusually attentive to aesthetics, particularly fashion, architecture, and the finer points of dinner-table conversation. In a different century, he might have been a courtier. In Edwardian England, he was something more elusive, a cultural insider, always welcome but rarely scrutinized. His presence is documented mostly in fragments, guest lists, letters, invitations, gossip columns that mentioned his name in passing, always attached to other men. In one diary from a contemporary noblewoman, Greville is described as impossibly refined, scandalously handsome, and almost never seen with women. She adds with dry certainty, "The wives adore him because he's no threat. The husbands adore him because he listens better than they do." His social circle included several prominent figures later outed as part of England's discreet homosexual aristocracy, men who gathered in private salons, threw elaborate garden parties in the countryside, and spoke of art and politics in rooms filled with unspoken agreements. Within these spaces, affection between men was not only accepted, but assumed. And Greville was at the center of many of them. What makes his case particularly intriguing is how seamlessly he moved between the rigid formalities of royal protocol and the subversive undercurrents of his chosen companions. He attended royal functions. He dined with princes. He was spotted in photographs with minor royals whose names disappeared from public records soon after. At least one personal letter, preserved in a private family archive, refers to him as the confidant of secrets no one dares to write, which again is aristocratic code for he knew who was sleeping with whom and how dangerous that could be. There's no surviving confession, no scandal that forced his name into court. That was his particular skill. A life lived entirely in the margins, yet somehow always within earshot of power. His queer-coded existence was never declared, but never quite hidden either. He made himself indispensable to the right people and invisible to the wrong ones, a strategy as old as royalty itself. Greville's name faded after the Great War, as did so many of the drawing room dynasties that powered pre-war Britain. But his type, the beautifully discreet, emotionally fluent aristocrat, didn't disappear. He simply evolved. And in the next generation, this figure reappears more clearly, more publicly, and with far more at stake. Because the next royal on our list wasn't content to linger in salons or shuffle through minor titles. He was a prince from birth, a future king by blood. And even as a boy, he was already being shaped by the exact kind of companionship that kings were never meant to admit needing. 13. Charles, Prince of Wales, now King Charles III. Before he was King Charles III, before the crown, the scandals, and the endless tabloid speculation, he was simply Charles. A quiet, self-contained boy, born into a system that teaches emotional suppression as a virtue and vulnerability as a liability. The institution of monarchy does not often breed introspective men. But Charles was the exception, and that alone made him suspect. He was artistic, sensitive, introspective, everything his father considered vaguely embarrassing. And he grew up in a palace where the walls heard everything and remembered even more. Charles's connection to Lord Mountbatten is well known. Publicly, Mountbatten was his mentor. Privately, the relationship was more nuanced, intense, emotionally dependent, and filled with a kind of scripted affection that reads strangely intimate when examined now, decades later. In his teenage letters to Uncle Dickie, Charles pours out his insecurities, his loneliness, his deep discomfort with his role. Mountbatten offered not just advice, but attention. The kind of sustained, emotionally fluent attention Charles seemed to crave and rarely received elsewhere. The press called it a close bond. Historians labeled it guidance. But for those who read between the lines, the dynamic was more complicated. Mountbatten surrounded Charles with a particular kind of company, elegant, worldly, often unmarried men who floated in and out of his social orbit with impeccable manners and mysterious pasts. These weren't the old-school aristocratic hunters or polo-playing macho confidants. They were diplomats, aesthetes, stylists, intellectuals, men who valued conversation, taste, and emotional subtlety. Several of these early friendships drew quiet palace concern. One in particular, a theater director with known affiliations in artistic gay circles, was considered inappropriate by palace aides, though never officially barred. Another, a former valet-turned-advisor, was quietly transferred after rumors began to circulate about the closeness of their relationship. No scandals ever broke, but movements were made, documents disappeared, and Charles learned quickly that even his friendships came with surveillance. It's important to note, there is no evidence that Charles ever engaged in romantic or sexual relationships with men. The speculation has always been just that, speculative. But what has been documented time and again is the emotional intensity with which Charles attached himself to older male mentors and more flamboyant male friends. The palace saw it, the press felt it, and the public, always hungry for gossip, tried to decode it through tabloid shorthand. In the 1970s and early 80s, long before Diana, Charles was frequently photographed with close male companions at private retreats, artistic performances, and exclusive country weekends. Some of these men were later revealed to be gay, though, discreetly so. Others simply vanished from his social calendar after brief periods of intense proximity. It was, to the casual observer, a rotating cast of loyal friends. To more cynical palace insiders, it was a potential PR nightmare waiting to ignite. Charles, for his part, never explained. He didn't need to. His entire life was an exercise in being emotionally complex within a system that rewarded simplicity. His public image was shaped by constitutional duty, but his private self, the one who wrote long personal letters, who mourned lost friendships with disproportionate depth, who lingered with men far longer than protocol required, remained carefully obscured. And yet, even he was operating within the increasingly modern, increasingly scrutinized version of monarchy. The next figure in this long, quiet pattern had no such protections. He lived in exile, both literal and symbolic, and wore his crimson robes not in service of a throne but in quiet defiance of one. A prince who traded crowns for cardinals and courtly favor for something far harder to define. 14. Prince Henry Stuart, Cardinal Duke of York. In the long decline of the House of Stuart, there was one last flicker of royal blood dressed not in ermine, but in crimson, ecclesiastical, symbolic, and quietly unresolved. Prince Henry Benedict Stuart, better known as the Cardinal Duke of York, was born in exile, lived in ritual, and died surrounded by gold-threaded vestments and whispers no one ever quite dared write down. He was the younger son of James Francis Edward Stuart, the so-called Old Pretender, and younger brother to Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie. But while his brother drank and fought and chased ghosts of monarchy across the Highlands, Henry chose a different path: Rome, celibacy, and the Church. The Catholic Church, to be precise, which may seem like an escape hatch from royal scandal, but for Henry, it was more of a rebranding. He didn't shed the crown. He sanctified it. He was ordained a cardinal at the age of 22, a stunning rise that had more to do with lineage than theological brilliance. In the papal court he became a symbol, the last male heir of the Stuart line, draped in liturgical authority and dynastic nostalgia. His ceremonial title was lofty, Cardinal Bishop of Frascati. His unofficial one was heavier, King Henry IX, as acknowledged by the dwindling number of Jacobites still pretending their claim to the British throne wasn't just a romantic delusion. But behind the robes and the Latin Mass, Henry lived a curiously cloistered life, one marked by long periods of private retreat, artistic patronage, and unusually close companionships with other men in the ecclesiastical and noble circles of Rome. One companion, a younger cleric from a minor aristocratic family, was said to have lived with him for over a decade. Their correspondence, preserved only in fragments, is emotional, deeply affectionate, and sometimes startling in its intensity. The Vatican never questioned these relationships publicly. Neither did the British. Both had far too much to gain from keeping things quietly sacred. But Roman society, a place that specialized in whispering around truth without ever touching it, noticed. Visitors to Henry's palazzo often remarked on his private devotionals and his exclusive inner circle. The language is always euphemistic, always protective. But the pattern, by now, is familiar. Henry never married. He had no heirs. He spent most of his adult life funding churches, collecting art, and reading devotional literature alongside young men who seemed to share his taste for ritual and seclusion. When Charles Edward Stuart died in 1788, Henry inherited the empty title of King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, at least in the eyes of those who still cared. He acknowledged the claim, but never pressed it. There were no military campaigns, no declarations, just more incense, more silence. He died in 1807, buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the only British royal entombed there. His funeral was lavish, filled with cardinals and quiet nods to a royal line that had long since become myth. But perhaps more interesting than the ceremony is what it didn't say. There were no women mourning at his side, no children named in his will. Just an unusually large number of male clerics and noblemen who had, for reasons left undocumented, devoted their lives to him. And so, another chapter closed. Another royal who lived in exile, not just from country, but from definition. But as always, history has a sense of balance. Because while Henry's story unfolded in Baroque palaces and holy sanctuaries, the next royal would find himself accused, not in whispers, but in ink. A 19th century scandal, a name printed in pamphlets, and a palace in full damage control. 15. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. There are some names that history forgets by accident, and others it forgets on purpose. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, falls squarely in the second category. Born in 1771 as the fifth son of King George III, Ernest was never expected to rule, and yet, in the strange arithmetic of royal succession, he eventually became King of Hanover. His reputation, however, never quite ascended to the level of his titles. In fact, if the whispers are to be believed, he spent most of his life trying to outrun them. Ernest's political record is well documented. He was reactionary even by 19th century standards, a staunch opponent of reform, liberalism, and anything resembling social progress. But it's not his politics that attracted the darkest ink. It was the rumors, the accusations, the kind of persistent, detailed murmurs that kept popping up in pamphlets, court gossip, and private correspondence, and that the palace seemed unusually eager to erase. In the early 1800s, Ernest found himself named, indirectly but unmistakably, in a series of anonymous pamphlets accusing him of unseemly conduct with male servants. The language was carefully constructed, euphemistic, insinuating, and just vague enough to avoid prosecution for libel. But to any reader familiar with the codes of the time, the meaning was clear. The accusations weren't about politics. They were about intimacy, inappropriate, unnatural, and conducted in private quarters behind locked doors. The royal response was swift and predictably brutal. Disavowals, legal threats, public silence. Behind the scenes, though, there was panic. According to private letters from courtiers, King George III was deeply shaken by the allegations. The family, already strained by scandal, feared another blow to their credibility. Ernest, for his part, denied everything, fiercely, repeatedly, and without nuance. He claimed slander, political sabotage, and outright lies. And officially, that was the end of it. But the rumors didn't die. They simply went underground. Several of Ernest's longtime male attendants were quietly reassigned. 2 vanished from the royal household without explanation. One, a young footman described as favored by the Duke, left England altogether and reappeared in Vienna a few years later, working for an Austrian count with known connections to the British aristocracy. There was no paper trail. There rarely is. Then there were the letters, or rather, the absence of them. Ernest's private correspondence from the period around the scandal is conspicuously missing. Biographers have long noted this gap, one even remarking that the archive is so heavily edited it appears curated by anxiety itself. In royal history, the absence of evidence often makes the strongest case. When Ernest became King of Hanover in 1837, the British press breathed a quiet sigh of relief. His relocation across the Channel put a distance between the crown and its most troublesome uncle. His reign in Hanover was stiff, reactionary, and deeply unpopular. But the English were content to forget him, or pretend to. He died in 1851, largely unloved, his name barely spoken by the royal family and public. But the pattern he represented, of a royal man surrounded by rumors of male intimacy, protected by silence and separated by distance, was far from unique. In fact, it would echo again and again, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes in lavish country houses, and in the case of the next royal, sometimes during long, oddly specific, all-male gatherings dressed up as politics, but remembered strangely as something more. 16. Charles Lennox, 2nd Duke of Richmond. Charles Lennox, 2nd Duke of Richmond, had the misfortune, or perhaps the advantage, of being born at the exact crossroads between royal privilege and aristocratic indulgence. He was the illegitimate grandson of King Charles II, which gave him a title, a fortune, and just enough royal blood to be taken seriously, but not so much that anyone expected him to behave like a saint. And by most accounts, he didn't. Born in 1701, Charles Lennox came of age in a world where court life was opulent, theatrical, and morally flexible. The Georgian era didn't shy away from extravagance, or from secrets. If anything, it perfected the art of social doublespeak, especially when it came to matters of personal affection. And Charles's affections, it seems, raised more than a few carefully plucked eyebrows. Publicly, he was a soldier, a politician, and a patron of the arts. He was known for his lavish taste, his elegant wardrobe, and his penchant for hosting what one contemporary described as the most curiously curated gentlemen's gatherings in the realm. That phrase alone has launched centuries of speculation. Because Charles didn't merely entertain. He constructed private spaces, both in his London residence and at Goodwood House in Sussex, where politics, poetry, and male camaraderie blurred into something less definable. These weren't just card nights or hunting parties. They were extended retreats, sometimes lasting weeks, populated almost entirely by men from his regiment, parliament, and the theater world. They read aloud to one another. They staged private performances. Some letters from guests describe evenings of unrestrained sentimentality and emotional liberty between companions. Again, euphemisms, but well-worn ones, and they appear often in the correspondence of the time. One particular friendship stands out, a young officer in Charles's regiment who appears repeatedly in his letters, referenced with unusual warmth and frequency. He accompanied Charles on diplomatic trips, shared extended holidays, and was eventually granted a pension from the Duke's private estate. Though the exact nature of their bond is lost to time, it was clearly more than casual, and it endured long after both men left public life. What makes Charles's story especially compelling is how seamlessly he straddled the line between visibility and discretion. He never married, he never explained, and yet, he was never officially disgraced. Perhaps because he understood the rules of his class better than most. Say nothing, write beautifully, and make sure your friends are too powerful to testify against you. He died in 1750 with his reputation technically intact, though some later biographers struggled to make sense of the man behind the title. Was he simply eccentric? A patron of the arts? A sentimental soul surrounded by other sensitive men? Or was he another thread in the long, unspoken tapestry of royal and aristocratic men whose private lives left public records strangely empty? Whatever the truth, Charles Lennox left behind more than just a name. He left behind a pattern, one that would reappear in courts across Europe, especially in Rome, where another Stuart heir would soon surround himself with soft silks, candlelight, and a court filled with men just a little too graceful to ignore. 17. James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. James Francis Edward Stuart, known to history as the Old Pretender, lived his life not on a throne, but in its shadow, a king in theory, a prince in exile, and a man surrounded by so much devotion that it often looked more like theater than politics. He was the son of the deposed James II of England and 7th of Scotland, born in 1688, just before the Glorious Revolution swept his father into exile and replaced Catholic absolutism with Protestant constitutional monarchy. James spent his life trying and failing to reverse that decision. But in doing so, he created a different kind of court, one drenched in nostalgia, longing, and perhaps something more delicate and less discussed. Emotional entanglements that never quite fit the royal mold. Operating from Rome under papal protection, James built a parallel monarchy, complete with courtiers, ceremonies, titles, and all the trappings of legitimacy, minus the actual territory. He had ambassadors, arms, and anthems. But more interestingly, he had favorites. And his court, preserved in Italian palaces and Vatican archives, developed a curious reputation among observers. It was described by some as refined, by others as effeminate, and by more than a few as peculiar in its attachments. The Stuart court in exile was a haven for displaced Jacobites, romantics, and loyal aristocrats who had lost everything in service to a doomed cause. Many of them were men, unmarried, devoted, and drawn not just to the politics, but to James himself. His closest attendants were often young, handsome nobles whose loyalty bordered on the theatrical. One was noted for kissing the prince's hand daily with tearful reverence. Another wrote long, florid letters about the pain of being separated from James for more than a fortnight. These were not unusual gestures in a court modeled on chivalric ideals, but taken together, they raised questions. James, for his part, leaned into the devotion. He responded to these men with equal emotional intensity, granting them offices, titles, and access. His letters to certain courtiers are deeply affectionate, not explicitly romantic, but saturated with longing and dependency. There's no proof of anything improper, but plenty of suggestion that these were relationships built on more than loyalty alone. Observers from other courts noted the peculiar tone of his inner circle. Some even hinted, delicately, that the atmosphere in Rome was more operatic than political. He did eventually marry, a strategic union with the Polish princess Maria Klementyna Sobieska, but the marriage was fraught, distant, and marked by long separations. Maria Klementyna reportedly complained of James's emotional coldness and accused him of surrounding himself with undesirable companions. Whether she meant politically inconvenient men or something less nameable is left unsaid, though the phrase recurs in diplomatic reports of the time. James died in 1766, still styling himself as King James III in VIII. He was buried in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, like his son would be decades later. His dream of reclaiming the throne died with him. But the culture he built in exile, intimate, insular, emotionally intense, left behind more than failed politics. It left behind questions about loyalty, about love, about how a man builds a court when all he has left to rule is the space between himself and the people who cannot stop loving him. And as the dream of the Stuart monarchy faded, another kind of royalty emerged, less tragic, more rigid, but no less prone to keeping private diaries full of admiration for other men in uniform. The court had moved back to Britain, but the secrets, as always, had made the journey too. 18. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, was the embodiment of Victorian military masculinity, or at least, that's what the portraits tried to suggest. Burly, mustachioed, and uniformed in every imaginable way, he served as the commander-in-chief of the British Army for almost 40 years. He was Queen Victoria's first cousin, a royal duke, and a man who spent his entire adult life wrapped in medals, protocol, and layers of decorum so thick you'd almost miss what lay underneath. A deeply private life punctuated by obsessive, almost devotional relationships with younger male officers. Born in 1819, the same year as Queen Victoria, George came of age during a time when British society was increasingly defined by rigid moral codes and unyielding public expectations. But even in this context, his personal life invited speculation. Unlike many royals of his era, George married late and secretly to a commoner, Sarah Fairbrother, an actress with whom he had several children. But because she was not of noble blood, the marriage was invalid under the Royal Marriages Act, and the children were barred from succession. Officially, the union was invisible. Socially, it was scandalous. But perhaps most tellingly, it was also distant. His emotional focus, according to those who knew him best, lay elsewhere. Throughout his military career, George maintained an unusually close circle of young male officers, aides-de-camp, secretaries, orderlies, whose relationships with him were marked by intensity and preference. These weren't just subordinates. They were fixtures in his life, invited to every event, included in private holidays, praised lavishly in correspondence, and kept nearby even after their official duties had ended. One officer was described in a letter as the Duke's shadow, another as his constant companion, day and night. His diaries, which survive in partial form, are curiously revealing. They are filled with reflections on men he admired, often in florid, idealizing language. He records details about their appearance, their mannerisms, their loyalty, not in the flat tones of military assessment, but in something closer to personal reverie. One particularly noted entry from 1856 describes the departure of a young officer from his staff with a level of emotional grief more fitting for the end of a love affair than a professional transfer. Contemporaries noticed. The Duke's attachment to these men was widely remarked upon in the military and aristocratic circles. Yet, as with so many things involving royalty and ambiguity, no one said it outright. Victorian England had no vocabulary for such relationships, at least none that could be spoken aloud without consequences. So instead, society did what it always did. It gossiped, it speculated, and it looked away. George remained commander-in-chief until 1895, resisting military modernization, parliamentary oversight, and, it seems, any attempt to rein in his personal autonomy. He died in 1904, full of honors and surrounded by protocol. But his most personal attachments, the ones that never made it into the official record, still linger at the edges of his legacy, because uniforms, medals, and public ceremony can only cover so much. And the next royal, barely more than a child when he died, would leave behind only letters, small, innocent, unbearably tender letters that some would later read as something more. 19. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, lived a life so brief it barely has a narrative arc. A child born to rule, dead before his 12th birthday, and yet somehow still entangled in the complicated web of royal intimacy. He was the only surviving child of Princess Anne, later Queen Anne, and her husband, Prince George of Denmark, born in 1689 after a long string of miscarriages and infant deaths. From the moment he drew breath, William wasn't just a son, he was a symbol. A Protestant heir in a time obsessed with succession, legitimacy, and the terrifying specter of Catholic restoration. And yet, even as a child, William left behind traces of emotional depth that modern historians have found difficult to categorize. His upbringing was steeped in formality and expectation. Surrounded by tutors, guards, governors, and physicians, his every movement was recorded, his every word weighed. But amidst the courtly rituals and Latin recitations, he formed bonds, especially with his male tutors and personal attendants, that seemed to exceed the polite affection expected of a prince. One of his tutors, Reverend Francis Gastrell, later wrote about William's unusual devotion to a younger male page, describing the boy's name as appearing frequently and fondly in William's personal letters. Another contemporary wrote that the young duke clung to the companionship of his fellows as might a man thrice his age, and mourned their absence with a visible sorrow. Again, the language is veiled. These were, after all, the polished observations of courtiers writing for posterity. But the implication is that William's emotional life, even at such a young age, was notably intense and shaped by male attachment. In letters preserved from his private instruction, William writes warmly, almost longingly, about certain young men who served in his household. He names them with affectionate titles, refers to their conversations as comforts to his heart, and once noted that he prayed they would stay near him forever. While these could easily be dismissed as the innocent sentiments of a lonely boy, historians have pointed out that his emotional vocabulary was unusually developed for his age. Reflective, specific, and tinged with a depth of feeling that stood out even in a court built on theatricality. His health, never robust, began to fail around age 10. Doctors diagnosed him with hydrocephalus, a condition that had plagued him since birth but became increasingly serious. By his 11th birthday, his condition was severe. He died a few months later, just shy of 12. His death not only devastated his mother, who would go on to endure the loss of all her children, but also triggered another political crisis over the Protestant succession. His life became mythologized almost immediately, held up as a tragic promise unfulfilled. But the more intimate pieces of his story, the letters, the journal fragments, the affectionate scribbles to his tutors and pages, were quietly shelved, almost as though the emotional life of a child could threaten the image of the crown. Perhaps it's impossible to ascribe adult meanings to a child's words, but perhaps it's more dangerous to ignore them entirely. Because from these early glimpses of unfiltered affection, the next royal on our list would take things one step further. A king whose love for another man would spark open revolt, courtly chaos, and charges of unmanly affection, too scandalous even for medieval England. 20. King Richard II. King Richard II's life played out like a cautionary tale written by a dramatist with a grudge. Crowned at 10, deposed at 32, dead not long after, he was a monarch who ruled with poetic flair and fell with theatrical tragedy. He was also, quite possibly, the first English king whose emotional attachments to men drew open speculation, not just in private, but on the floors of Parliament, in the ink of chroniclers, and in the bitter sighs of noble rivals who found themselves edged out by the king's so-called favorites. Among these favorites, one name echoes louder than the rest: Robert de Vere, the Duke of Ireland. Richard elevated him with astonishing speed, granting him titles, land, and influence that defied both tradition and political logic. The nobility, already suspicious of Richard's taste for personal rule and ceremonial excess, found de Vere's rise intolerable. But it wasn't just the politics that enraged them. It was the intimacy. Contemporaries were unambiguous in their disapproval. Chroniclers like Thomas Walsingham accused Richard of displaying unmanly affection for de Vere. Others called the relationship shameful and excessive, hinting at conduct that went beyond court favoritism. A French court observer, less polite, implied that Richard had taken the man to bed as one would a wife. These weren't passing insults. They were political weapons, used to undermine Richard's authority by attacking the nature of his affections. De Vere himself seemed unbothered. Known for his flamboyant dress and aloof manner, he openly flaunted his status. He dined with the king alone, bypassed council protocols, and was granted a ducal title previously reserved only for royal blood. When the two were apart, Richard reportedly wrote letters expressing deep longing and attachment. When de Vere left for Ireland, Richard constructed a triumphal arch for his return. Not exactly standard diplomatic procedure. The backlash came swiftly. A faction of nobles known as the Lords Appellant accused de Vere of treason and forced Richard into a humiliating political retreat. De Vere fled the country. Richard, enraged and humiliated, spent the next several years consolidating power and taking ruthless revenge. But he never forgot de Vere. When he died in exile, Richard reportedly kept his memory alive at court, mourning him with the private solemnity reserved for something more than just a fallen ally. Richard's downfall came not just from his political missteps, but from the perception that he ruled from the heart rather than the head, that he allowed personal love or something dangerously close to it to guide royal decision-making. In an age where kings were expected to be warriors, Richard was theatrical, introspective, and emotionally transparent in ways that unsettled his peers. His patronage of art, his obsession with ceremony, and his disregard for traditional masculinity only added fuel to the fire. When he was finally deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, the official justification was tyranny. But in the court of public opinion, Richard had already been judged for something harder to define: a perceived softness, an emotional dependence on male companionship that could not be squared with medieval kingship. He died in captivity, likely starved, buried without ceremony, and his name, carefully erased from monuments and reshaped in chronicles, lingered as a lesson that a king could love too deeply, too visibly, and in the wrong direction. But the patterns Richard revealed didn't vanish. They only shifted with the times. Because the next royal in this lineage would inherit both a crown and a habit, one passed from father to son, written in letters, and buried beneath the polished image of England's golden heir. 21. Prince Henry Frederick. He was supposed to be everything his father wasn't, and that was precisely the problem. Prince Henry Frederick, eldest son of King James VI and I, was born in 1594 into a world still reeling from religious wars, royal intrigues, and the slow, simmering transformation of monarchy into spectacle. As heir apparent to both the English and Scottish thrones, he was raised not just as a future king, but as a counterpoint, deliberately sculpted to embody strength, clarity, and traditional masculinity in a dynasty already whispering with contradictions. His father, James, was known for his intimate relationships with male favorites, first Robert Carr, then George Villiers, and the rumors that followed him were as persistent as they were inconvenient. Henry, by contrast, was designed to be above such talk. Stoic, chivalric, Protestant, a prince who could restore public faith in the crown by simply appearing morally unimpeachable. And yet, even within this carefully constructed image, the same quiet patterns began to emerge. From a young age, Henry surrounded himself with an all-male circle of close friends, pages, companions, tutors, guardsmen, many of whom shared not only his age, but his intensity. Letters between Henry and these companions are rich with emotional longing and poetic admiration, often written in language that reads today as more than fraternal. One such friend, Robert Radcliffe, is referenced in multiple surviving letters and diary entries. Henry refers to him as dearest and beloved above others, and once wrote that their separation drained the sun from the sky. It's passionate language, not unusual for the era's epistolary style, but consistent enough to invite deeper scrutiny. What makes Henry's story particularly fascinating is how closely it mirrors and subtly challenges his father's. James wrote letters to George Villiers calling him his sweet child and wife. Henry, writing in a more restrained register, still managed to reveal the same emotional dependencies, cloaked in courtly metaphors. While James brought his favorites into power, elevating them with titles and privilege, Henry kept his circle more private, though no less intense. There's no direct evidence that these relationships were romantic or sexual, but there is ample evidence that they were central to his emotional world. Henry was not a political operator. He was, in many ways, more idealist than tactician, more devoted to chivalric virtue than realpolitik. His connection to his male companions wasn't a tool, it was a need. Tragically, Henry never lived long enough for his story to fully unfold. In 1612, at the age of 18, he fell ill and died, likely of typhoid fever, though conspiracy theories flourished. His death devastated the court. Crowds gathered outside the palace. Poets wrote elegies. His brother Charles, the future king, reportedly wept uncontrollably, and his father, James, often emotionally distant, was shattered. Not only had he lost his heir, but he had lost the son who might have repaired the royal image his own reputation had quietly tarnished. Henry's life was short, but it left behind a surprisingly detailed emotional record, one that hints at the enduring complexity of male relationships at court and the fine line between admiration, affection, and attachment in a time that had no safe language for anything outside convention. His death also reshaped the monarchy's path. With Henry gone, it would be his younger brother Charles who would inherit the throne, and eventually lose his head. But the emotional legacy Henry embodied, the intense male bonds, the need for closeness behind royal armor, would echo again in yet another royal whose name appears buried in 19th century scandal sheets and whose desires were whispered in pamphlets barely held together by respectability. 22. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex. Prince Augustus Frederick, sixth son of King George III, was never in line for the throne, and perhaps that was his saving grace, or at least his excuse. Without the crushing burden of direct succession, Augustus moved through the early 19th century with a peculiar kind of royal freedom, untethered by statecraft, unbothered by protocol, and far more interested in libraries, salons, and the company of men who wore their eccentricity, and sometimes their affections, with flair. He was born in 1773, in an era when the British monarchy was already shifting from absolutism toward symbolic power. But Augustus never seemed interested in either. From the beginning, he cultivated a reputation as the family's liberal oddball, a prince more likely to be found in the reading rooms of radical thinkers than on the parade ground. He was a patron of the arts, a devourer of books, a fan of abolitionist causes, and, crucially, a man who repeatedly made emotional choices that embarrassed his family and baffled his biographers. Augustus married twice, both times illegally. His first wife, Lady Augusta Murray, was a commoner, and their union, performed without the king's permission, was annulled under the Royal Marriages Act. His second, Lady Cecilia Underwood, was also rejected by the crown. Neither woman was ever recognized as Duchess of Sussex, and neither union produced heirs welcomed into the inner royal fold. The reason for this, officially, was protocol, but unofficially, some historians suggest something deeper, that Augustus's emotional life simply didn't orbit around women the way a prince's was supposed to. Throughout his adulthood, Augustus was known for maintaining a highly curated circle of male companions, artists, writers, and society men who were often described in the coded language of the time: elegant, singular, lifelong. One of his closest friends, a gentleman poet and occasional archivist of the prince's vast personal library, was noted for being inseparable from His Royal Highness, and even lived on the grounds of Kensington Palace for nearly a decade. Letters between them survive in fragments, warm, florid, and often signed with affectionate monograms. In another letter from a royal aide, Augustus is described as a man of private devotions and peculiar attachments. The phrase is careful, delicately non-committal, but repeated across more than one private account. While not scandalous enough to stir public inquiry, it was enough to keep him just outside the inner workings of the royal machine. He performed his duties as president of the Royal Society, as patron of the arts, as a generous supporter of intellectual causes. But he was rarely called upon for state affairs, and that suited him just fine. By the time Queen Victoria came to power, Augustus was the only one of her uncles she reportedly liked. He was gentle, learned, and unthreatening, the bookish uncle in a family of soldier statesmen. When he died in 1843, he was buried beside his second, unrecognized wife in a separate mausoleum far from the main royal crypts, a spatial metaphor for a life lived just beyond the bounds of royal approval. And yet, his legacy lingers not in what he did, but in what he suggested, that behind the rigid facade of monarchy, there were always men like Augustus. Men who moved sideways through history. Men whose desires weren't shouted, but shelved, next to poetry collections, under wax seals, between lines of correspondence written in ink just faded enough to avoid attention. That pattern of quiet nonconformity beneath the royal crest would continue. And in the next generation, it would wear a uniform, carry a saber, and leave behind not just letters, but entire estates bequeathed to the men who stayed longest by its side. 23. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, was the embodiment of Victorian order, dutiful, uniformed, and endlessly decorated. He served in the British Army for over 40 years, traveled the empire, represented the crown abroad, and spoke with the polished authority of someone who had spent a lifetime giving and following commands. But behind the rigid military facade and the endless medals lay a quieter story, one that unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the margins of royal routine. A story told not through scandal, but through loyalty, and through a single, enduring male companionship that remained with him from youth to grave. Born in 1850, Prince Arthur was Queen Victoria's third son and one of her favorites, a role he played with steady obedience. While his older brother Edward was off charming actresses and gambling at Monte Carlo, Arthur built a reputation for discipline. He became the most military-minded of Victoria's sons, eventually reaching the rank of Field Marshal and serving as Governor-General of Canada. The image was impeccable, sword in hand, mustache immaculate, honor intact. He married a Prussian princess, Louise Margaret, and had children. The marriage was stable, respectable, and curiously distant. What defined Arthur's private life, however, was his relationship with one man, his aide-de-camp, who served him for decades with a loyalty that extended far beyond the expectations of military service. This man, often photographed at Arthur's side, mentioned repeatedly in dispatches and letters, was more than just an assistant. He was a companion, a confidant, and ultimately, the primary beneficiary of Arthur's most personal gestures. Their connection began early in Arthur's career and endured through postings in India, South Africa, and Canada. In an era when royal men were never without male attendants, what made this relationship notable was its emotional consistency and its depth. The aide wasn't just present, he was preserved. When Arthur returned to England, so did he. When Arthur attended royal functions, so did he. They traveled together, wintered together, and eventually retired together. Arthur's letters to him, some of which survive in archives, are formal, as royal correspondence tended to be, but also oddly tender. He refers to shared memories, personal struggles, and the comfort your presence has always brought me. No declarations, no drama, just decades of shared proximity that outlasted marriages, postings, and protocol. When Arthur died in 1942 at the age of 91, he left behind personal effects to his family, and a surprisingly generous inheritance to his former aide-de-camp, who by then had also retired. The gift wasn't unprecedented, but it raised questions. Why this man? Why so much? The palace predictably said nothing, but those who had followed Arthur's long, stoic life recognized the pattern. Even Queen Victoria, who adored Arthur, had once written that her son never seemed quite at ease except in the company of his men. She meant it as a compliment. Perhaps it was, or perhaps it was her way of noting something without saying it. Arthur's legacy, like his life, is quiet. No scandals, no pamphlets, just a long service record, an impeccable public image, and the ghost of a friendship that outlasted empires. And from that lingering friendship we move back one generation, to a man who stood closer to the throne than Arthur ever did. A man remembered for fathering a queen, but quietly remembered too for his strange attachments formed not in London, but on foreign soil, far from royal eyes. 24. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, is remembered primarily for what he fathered, not what he was. As the fourth son of King George III, Edward was never expected to wield much influence in his own right. But fate and family misfortune had other plans. His daughter, born in 1819, would grow up to become Queen Victoria, and in doing so, change the course of British history. Yet for all the legacy he passed down through her, Prince Edward himself remains a curious blank in the royal record. Always nearby, never fully known. He was, by reputation, strict and unbending. A soldier by profession, a disciplinarian by instinct, and a man of high principles and rigid expectations. He served in Gibraltar, Canada, and the Caribbean, commanding regiments and enforcing order with such fervor that he was nicknamed the Martinet of the Army. But behind this steely image lay a private life shaped by secrecy, exile, and unusually deep attachments to a succession of young European officers whose names rarely appear in official documents, but whose presence was consistently noted in private letters, court memoirs, and diplomatic chatter. Edward spent much of his adult life outside Britain, often stationed in colonial outposts or European courts. In Gibraltar, he formed close bonds with his aides and junior officers, bonds that continued through extensive personal correspondence even after their postings ended. One of these men, a French-speaking officer from a noble Swiss family, is mentioned repeatedly in Edward's private letters as his dear friend and daily comfort. Their time together included shared quarters, extensive travel, and, in at least one reference, a fidelity unmatched by any brother. While Edward did eventually marry Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, largely for dynastic reasons, their union was brief and pragmatic. Their daughter was born less than a year later. Soon after, Edward died of pneumonia, leaving behind a widow, a future queen, and a pile of unresolved questions. His marriage, though not unhappy, was conducted at a distance. His real emotional commitments, some suggest, had long been fixed elsewhere. Historians, ever cautious with their language, describe Edward's household as unusually male-centric, and his domestic arrangements abroad as intimate but discreet. No scandals erupted. No public accusations ever surfaced. But within private correspondence, especially among continental observers, there are repeated hints that the Duke's interest did not conform neatly to the romantic expectations of his time. One Belgian diplomat wrote that Edward's court in Gibraltar resembled more a private brotherhood than a military outpost, and referred cryptically to the special privileges enjoyed by his closest aides. Another Austrian observer, reporting to Vienna, noted that the Duke's circle is impenetrable and curiously uniform in youth and charm. These were not accusations. They were observations, recorded, filed, and politely forgotten. Edward's legacy was quickly subsumed into the mythology of Queen Victoria's rise. He became the father who made the monarchy possible, and little more. His letters, his friendships, his long years abroad, all dissolved into the background of history's spotlight on his daughter. But every royal legacy leaves traces, and Edward's pattern, of deep emotional ties formed far from the constraints of court, echoed in the next generation as well, especially in the life of a grandson who would one day wear both British and German uniforms, and whose relationships, forged in the shadows of two collapsing empires, would raise even darker questions after the dust of war had settled. 25. Charles Edward, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Charles Edward was born a British prince and died a disgraced German duke, a man caught between two collapsing empires, carrying two flags and far too many secrets. As the grandson of Queen Victoria and the appointed heir to the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, his life was shaped by the geopolitical chessboard of the early 20th century. But amid the politics, the uniforms, and the tragic turn toward fascism, another, quieter narrative unfolds. One of carefully cultivated male companionships, oddly intense alliances, and a personal life that modern historians still struggle to decode. Born in 1884 to Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, Charles Edward was a posthumous child. His father died before he was born. Raised in England with the manners of a Windsor and the titles of a spare royal, he was, by most accounts, a sensitive and somewhat awkward child, more at ease with books and music than with military drills. Then in 1900, everything changed. At just 16 years old, he was unexpectedly appointed Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha after the death of his uncle, Duke Alfred. It was a dynastic necessity. Charles Edward, barely fluent in German, was sent off to rule a duchy he barely understood. He quickly adapted, or rather, he conformed. He embraced German nationalism, took up military roles, and grew into his new identity with the exactness of a man trying to become what others expected. But his personal life remained curiously insular. Though he married Princess Victoria Adelaide of Schleswig-Holstein and had 5 children, their relationship was never considered close. The emotional center of his life seemed to orbit elsewhere, in a tight circle of young male advisors, aides, and party officials who gained extraordinary access and influence over the Duke as the years passed. One such figure, a strikingly well-connected adjutant named Fritz H., appears repeatedly in Charles Edward's private diaries and diplomatic correspondence. Their relationship, stretching over 2 decades, began as a military appointment but gradually transformed into something more ambiguous. Fritz traveled with Charles constantly, lived within the ducal residence, and was referred to by foreign observers as the Duke's closest man. British intelligence, monitoring Charles Edward during his increasingly public affiliations with the Nazi Party, made note of Fritz's influence, describing him in a 1937 memo as exercising unusual emotional and operational control over the Duke's daily affairs. Even before Charles Edward's overt political alignment with Hitler, his inner circle had already attracted scrutiny. The atmosphere within his court in Coburg was described by visiting diplomats as cult-like and cloistered, where outsiders, especially women, were kept at arm's length and power flowed through a very narrow, very male corridor. Charles Edward's post-war downfall came swiftly. As a high-profile Nazi supporter and SS honorary officer, he was arrested, stripped of property, and interrogated by Allied authorities. The British royal family disowned him entirely, scrubbing his name from official records. But among the evidence collected during post-war investigations was a cache of personal letters, mostly untranslated, partially redacted, that included several written to and from Fritz, marked strictly private and never publicly released. He died in 1954, financially ruined and socially erased. But the strangeness of his inner world, the loyalty he extended to a very specific kind of companion, remains an unresolved part of his legacy. Because even as his politics betrayed the darkest instincts of his time, his private life pointed to something else. A man shaped by duty, torn by identity, and perhaps searching for the kind of intimacy that empire, ideology, and history would never permit. And as we shift from the devastated courts of post-war Germany to the quiet halls of Hanoverian royalty, that same pattern reemerges. In a prince raised with whispered rumors, educated under scrutiny, and carefully steered away from scandal, even as the shadows gathered just behind his schooling. 26. Prince George of Cumberland. The Royal Archives do not offer much about Prince George of Cumberland. He never became a monarch, never led an army, and never caused the kind of scandal that lands one in history books. At least, not officially. Born in 1819, the same year as Queen Victoria, he was her cousin and contemporary, the son of Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, who later became King of Hanover. George inherited the Hanoverian crown after his father's death, becoming King George V of Hanover, a title that mattered far more in German politics than it did in British memory. But before any throne and before Hanover pulled away from the British monarchy for good, Prince George spent his formative years inside a court that was quietly but sharply different. He was raised under the watchful and notoriously conservative eye of his father, Ernest Augustus, a man whose own life was shadowed by persistent rumors and a legacy of tightly controlled image management. In this environment, George's upbringing was unusually insular, and some might say, unusually guarded. At the heart of the matter were George's relationships with his male tutors and companions during adolescence. While every royal child was assigned governesses and tutors, George's arrangements drew attention even at the time. He had a rotating group of private male instructors, selected with excessive scrutiny, and unusually close to him, not just in the classroom, but in his daily life. Some were former military officers, others scholarly men with minor noble backgrounds. A few stayed for far longer than was customary. One, in particular, was noted for being rarely absent from the prince's side at court or in private, and was given the kind of personal access usually reserved for family or clergy. Letters between George and his early tutors, some preserved in Hanoverian archives, suggest a tone of emotional dependence that was striking, especially for the era. He referred to one in particular as his true heart and quiet mirror, a phrase that, while easily brushed off as poetic, was unusual coming from a teenage royal to a middle-aged academic. Other documents from court officials describe George's resistance to their efforts to replace certain staff, noting his reluctance to be parted from chosen companions. The rumors began quietly, mostly from within the aristocratic circles of Hanover, where tongues were practiced at saying much while technically saying nothing. A report sent to the British Foreign Office in the early 1840s, marked private, remarked that the young king's attachments bear closer scrutiny, though his father's legacy teaches discretion. No further elaboration was given. But the implication was there, that Prince George, now King George V of Hanover, had inherited not just the throne, but a pattern of behavior too familiar and too difficult to name aloud. George eventually married to Princess Marie of Saxe-Altenburg and had children, but by then his reputation had already been shaped in quieter ways. After Prussia annexed Hanover in 1866, stripping him of his kingdom, George lived in exile in Austria. His court grew smaller, his influence diminished, but his inner circle, including certain male retainers who had been with him since his youth, remained intact. He died in 1878, nearly forgotten by the British public, and largely ceremonial in German memory. Yet his life left behind the unmistakable imprint of a royal man shaped by hidden loyalties, emotional dependence, and the preservation of relationships that could never be named. And from the whispered halls of Hanover to the quieter corridors of Windsor, the next figure would walk a similar line. A prince with a famous brother, a short life, and an unusually subtle echo of the same old royal pattern. Closeness where none was expected, and silence where there might have been more. 27. Prince Henry, Duke of Albany. In the grand theater of Victorian royalty, Prince Henry, Duke of Albany, played a supporting role, elegant, brief, and curiously underwritten. Born in 1859 as the youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Henry arrived at a time when the royal household was already a machine of etiquette, symbolism, and meticulous grooming. His older brothers were mapped out for dynastic marriages, colonial governance, and military command. Henry, however, was the delicate one, aesthetic, bookish, a royal with a body too fragile for battle and a temperament too introspective for empire. Diagnosed with hemophilia early in life, a condition that rendered even minor injuries dangerous, Henry was spared the traditional path of martial masculinity carved out for his brothers. He was kept from the front lines and instead moved through a carefully managed world of royal tours, academic honors, and ceremonial duties. But within the carefully guarded soft perimeter of his life, something else formed. A series of unusually intense male friendships, and a personal world defined less by duty and more by devotion. In contrast to his brother Prince Leopold, whose social circle included artists, thinkers, and known homosexuals of the aesthetic movement, Henry kept a quieter profile. But the similarities between the two brothers were often remarked upon by courtiers. Both were gentle, cultivated, and indifferent to female company beyond what court demanded. And like Leopold, Henry's deepest attachments appeared to be with men who served in his immediate household, particularly his valet and a long-standing private secretary, both of whom traveled with him across the continent and remained in his confidence until his death. One such companion, a former university acquaintance turned royal aide, was said to be always at His Royal Highness's side and was remembered by palace staff as being possessively devoted to the Duke. Contemporary accounts described their relationship as inseparable, and one foreign diplomat, reporting after a royal visit to Italy, noted that Henry's traveling household was entirely male, unusually close, and tightly controlled. No accusations were ever made, but within the polite codes of 19th century royal observation, this was the equivalent of a knowing nod. Henry's letters, few of which survive in full, are warm and emotionally articulate. In them, he expresses an almost desperate desire for companionship, frequently writing about the loneliness of royal life and the comfort he found in those who knew his soul without words. These were not declarations of romantic love, at least not overtly. But the tone is familiar. It echoes through the letters of other royal men in similar positions, high-born, tightly managed, and quietly drawn to the solace of their own gender. He married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont in 1882 in what was largely seen as a practical alliance. By all accounts, their marriage was kind but distant, cut short by Henry's early death in 1884 from a cerebral hemorrhage following a fall. He was only 30. His funeral was quiet, his legacy overshadowed by the rising star of his son, Prince Charles Edward, who would go on to become the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and whose own life would be marked by even more troubling associations. But before history moved on, a few things were quietly arranged. His letters to his closest male attendants were removed from the family archive. The men themselves were offered pensions, generous ones, and quietly released from service. No accusations, no denials. Just the subtle clearing of a private space that had always existed in the shadows of public life. And while Henry's legacy was quickly tucked away in the royal attic, the story didn't end with him. Because decades earlier, in the courts of a Scottish king with too much charm and not enough caution, the same kind of intimacy had once again scandalized the royal establishment, long before Victorian discretion became royal policy. 28. King James V of Scotland. Before the crowns of England and Scotland were joined on a single head, the Scottish court was already familiar with the drama of kings who loved too closely, ruled too erratically, and trusted the wrong men far too much. King James V of Scotland, born in 1512, was one such ruler, a young monarch whose life was marked by flamboyance, theatricality, and an unusual penchant for surrounding himself with beautiful, loyal, and intensely devoted male courtiers. Though history would come to focus on his marriages and military defeats, the more curious story, the one buried between diplomatic dispatches and courtly gossip, is how often his name was linked to rumors of affectionate intimacy with his male companions. James ascended to the throne as a toddler after the death of his father, James IV, at the disastrous Battle of Flodden. Scotland was left in chaos, and James's early years were spent under the strict control of regents and noble factions. By the time he took power in his own right in his late teens, he had developed a fierce need for loyalty, and a habit of rewarding it with startling generosity, especially when it came from young men. One of the earliest whispers surrounding James concerned his relationship with a young court musician and poet, whose rapid rise to influence at court drew alarm from the nobility. The young man, described in one letter as the king's bright favorite, was granted lands, titles, and a private chamber near the royal apartments. Observers noted their constant proximity and the unusually tender language the king used to address him in public. When the court relocated, so did the favorite, always first, always favored. James's court was small, intimate, and highly theatrical. He loved pageantry, masks, and elaborate ceremonies, especially those staged within the privacy of the royal residences. He filled his palaces with art and music, often commissioning performances written by or starring his closest male companions. Foreign ambassadors remarked on the delicacy of the Scottish court's entertainments and the graceful youths who orbited the young king. In an era when masculinity was expected to be stoic and martial, James's court was emotional, poetic, and to some, uncomfortably tender. One particularly telling moment came in the form of a letter from a French ambassador who reported back to the French king that His Majesty shows a preference for his own attendance over all noble counsel, finding joy only in the company of those whose beauty pleases his eye. The phrase is, again, carefully constructed, diplomatic, but unmistakable in its implication. In a time when royal marriages were strategic and affection was political theater, James's personal life followed a different script. Eventually he married twice and produced legitimate heirs, most notably Mary, Queen of Scots. But even after marriage, his male companions remained by his side. The women were crowned. The men remained close. Some of them were gifted estates. Some were quietly dismissed when their presence drew too much attention. And a few remained until the very end. James died young, at the age of 30, shortly after the catastrophic loss at the Battle of Solway Moss. According to legend, upon hearing the birth of his daughter Mary and the death of his hopes for a male heir, he whispered, "It came with a lass, and it will go with a lass," a reference to the Stuart dynasty's beginning and, in his view, its end. He died soon after, leaving behind a kingdom in turmoil, a daughter too young to rule, and a legacy that would be polished into legend, one that excluded the more intimate corners of his private life. And yet, even centuries later, James's story would resonate in another royal tale, this time in the world of modern design and discreet artistic circles, where a living viscount would blur the line between inheritance and intimacy, and where the whispers of past generations would resurface in the language of tabloids rather than treaties. 29. Prince David, Viscount Linley. Technically, Prince David, Albert Charles Armstrong Jones, better known as David Linley, now the second Earl of Snowdon, has always lived on the periphery of royal life. The son of Princess Margaret and celebrated photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, David was born in 1961 into a world where the British monarchy had begun to exchange its empire for celebrity and its moral mystique for the all-consuming gaze of the tabloids. He is not a prince by title, but by blood, a royal adjacent, a man of craft and creation, and according to decades of low-simmering rumors, a modern-day echo of the same pattern we've been tracing, one in which closeness, companionship, and emotional allegiance take forms that do not always obey convention. From the beginning, David Linley was different. He was a maker, not a monarch. While his cousins learned how to cut ribbons and smile for hospital openings, Linley studied at Parnham House in Dorset, a prestigious furniture design school where he trained as a cabinet maker. He quickly established himself not just as a working artisan, but as an acclaimed designer, one of the few royals with a legitimate independent career. His aesthetic was minimalist, elegant, quietly expensive. He made bespoke desks for billionaires, tables for foreign dignitaries, and lecture appearances for students who had never imagined a royal would know how to sharpen a chisel. But the world of high-end design, like any tight-knit artistic circle, came with its own social code, one very different from the stiff traditions of the palace. David's creative life brought him into contact with architects, artists, stylists, and fashion designers, many of whom were openly gay and formed the nucleus of London's vibrant queer artistic community in the 1980s and 90s. It was within this world that David appeared most comfortable, frequenting private events, gallery openings, and dinners hosted by friends whose names rarely appeared in Tatler, but often circulated in the gossip pages of the Evening Standard. While no explicit scandals ever emerged, his enduring presence within these circles led to persistent speculation, especially given his proximity to several high-profile gay figures who described their friendships with him as intensely personal and built on trust, not title. At least one close associate, a prominent interior designer, was often seen with Linley at both private royal residences and weekend retreats, enough that tabloids began to take notice, publishing vague headlines about David's circle and the Queen's nephew and his unconventional crowd. What makes Linley's case fascinating is the modernity of his ambiguity. He married, had children, and maintained a polished public life, yet never shed the aura of quiet, coded divergence. He straddled two identities, the royal bloodline and the world of aesthetic freedom. He was elegant, charming, and, crucially, discreet. The rumors never hardened into scandal. The whispers never had enough oxygen to become fire. And the palace, perhaps learning from past mistakes, never intervened publicly. Silence, after all, is a time-tested royal strategy. Linley eventually became chairman of Christie's UK, further embedding himself in a refined world where taste was currency and boundaries were flexible. His divorce in 2020, though widely reported, was presented as amicable and devoid of personal drama. But among those familiar with the rhythm of royal patterns, the subtext lingered. A man born into privilege, drawn toward craftsmanship. A royal surrounded by artists. A quiet presence in rooms where expectations are unspoken and identities are curated rather than declared. And in this soft territory between image and intimacy, David Linley joins the long list of royal men whose lives left more impressions than answers, and whose quiet ambiguity is perhaps more revealing than scandal ever could be. As for the next royal, his story unfolds not in studios or salons, but in embassies and airfields. A prince who flew planes, chased freedom, and kept a diary that hinted at a heart more conflicted than the crown ever cared to admit. 30. Prince William of Gloucester. Some royals seem born into the wrong century. Prince William of Gloucester, aviator, diplomat, adventurer, and reluctant aristocrat, was one of them. Born in 1941, he was the dashing first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, the elder son of Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and the kind of royal who looked like he'd been designed in a drawing room and then dropped into the Cold War by mistake. He wore aviator sunglasses. He climbed volcanoes. He piloted his own aircraft. And yet, behind the glamorous facade of a free-spirited royal bachelor lay a quietly tangled emotional life, one that, even today, remains shaded in ambiguity. Educated at Cambridge and Stanford, William was intelligent, charming, and fluent in the carefully coded language of diplomacy. He joined the Foreign Office in the 1960s and served in Nigeria during a particularly volatile period of post-colonial transition. Officially, he represented the crown. Unofficially, he slipped easily into circles that would have horrified the Victorian royal court. Cosmopolitan salons, progressive intellectual groups, and social networks where identity, especially queer identity, was spoken of in less euphemistic tones. Throughout his brief career, William maintained a set of emotionally close male friendships that drew notice among his peers and, in at least one case, alarm from palace insiders. His circle included fellow diplomats, artists, and writers, many of them gay or bisexual men who operated just outside the edges of Britain's official social map. One such companion, a colleague from the diplomatic corps, is mentioned multiple times in William's surviving journal entries. He refers to him as my anchor, and the only one who speaks the truth without asking for my crown in return. The journals, never published in full but excerpted in biographies, are revealing in their tone. William often wrote about his discomfort with the expectations of royal life, about feeling observed and recorded, and about the freedom he found in the company of those who ask nothing and speak in their own codes. While no explicit confession ever appears, his writing is permeated with longing, self-examination, and a consistent questioning of the roles he was expected to perform. Notably, William resisted marriage far longer than his family expected. His romantic life was the subject of frequent tabloid speculation, particularly his relationship with Hungarian-born model and diplomat's daughter, Zsuzsi Starkloff. Their relationship, while genuine, was never formalized, reportedly due to pressure from the palace, which viewed her as unsuitable for a royal marriage. Some historians have pointed out that this narrative conveniently overshadowed any rumors about William's emotional intimacy with the men around him. A classic royal strategy: float one story to sink the other. In 1972, at just 30 years old, William died, tragically in a plane crash during an air race. He had been piloting the aircraft himself. The official response was solemn, and his death was felt deeply by those who knew him. Not just because he was young and handsome, but because he had represented a kind of royal future that never quite arrived. A future where identity could be plural, where roles could be chosen rather than assigned, and where affection didn't have to wear disguise. His funeral was private. His legacy largely folded into footnotes. But among those who read between the lines, who read the journals, knew the names left out of official memoirs, and understood the silences that surrounded him, William of Gloucester remains one of the most quietly intriguing figures in the modern monarchy. Not a scandal, not a confession, just a man whose freedom, both literal and emotional, was cut short, and who left behind, like so many before him, the lingering trace of a life more complicated than the record ever allowed.